This is your third lecture on the religion of Judaism.
We left off on the previous lecture with the priest and prophet and really the last of the judges named Samuel being told by the people of Israel that they want a king like all of the other nations. Yahweh and Samuel reluctantly agree to this request, and eventually Yahweh shows Samuel that he has anointed a very tall and handsome young man from the tribe of Benjamin named Saul to be the very first king. Now Yahweh has done this anointing, but Samuel continues this process of anointing, which means to be touched by or selected by God for a special purpose. And Samuel goes through the ritual of anointing, which involves taking some consecrated oil and placing it upon the head. Sometimes just a small bit of oil, sometimes an enormous amount of oil is poured on top of the person's head. And so Saul receives this anointing, and he becomes the very first king of Israel. He turns out to be a very poor king. He makes some mistakes. On one occasion, he is given the order to carry out herem, or holy war, which means the utter destruction of the enemy, every man, woman, and child, even all of the animals. And this is an order given by Yahweh in the book of Deuteronomy, and then it's carried out in later books, and certainly this is one of those stories. And Saul fails to obey this order of herem by allowing the king of the enemy and the animals of the enemy to live. Samuel shows up on the scene and takes out his sword and slaughters the king of the Amalekites, who Israel and Saul had just defeated. And so this is seen to be a mark of disobedience from Saul. And furthermore, Saul also becomes impatient before going into battle, waiting for Samuel to come and make a sacrifice so that they will be blessed in battle. Only Samuel as priest should be able to make this sacrifice. And Saul is so presumptuous that he takes the task on himself and he makes the sacrifice, which he is not supposed to do. And once again, we see him being disobedient. Yahweh eventually becomes so upset with Saul and his disobedience that Yahweh decides to anoint someone else to be king, even while Saul is still living. The story says that Yahweh not only removes his spirit from Saul, but he sends an evil spirit upon Saul to haunt him. Samuel is given directions by Yahweh to the family where the new king will be found. The father of the family is named Jesse, and Jesse's sons are brought before Samuel one by one, and Samuel does not receive the signal from Yahweh that any of these are the one that Yahweh has selected to be the next king. And so Samuel eventually asked, "Are these all the sons you have? Is there no one else?" And Jesse replies that his youngest son, Dawid, is out in the fields watching the animals, and Samuel is brought out to the field. He sees David and seems to be almost an immediate recognition that David is the one who should be king, and so he is anointed on the spot, and he receives the Spirit of Yahweh. So here we have a young boy named David who has been anointed as the next king, but no one knows this except David's father and Samuel and Yahweh. Everyone else, of course, still recognizes Saul as king. Well, now remember that Saul is being haunted by this evil spirit now, and it plagues him so much that he demonstrates what we would call severe mental illness today. And the only thing that can calm him is for someone to play the harp. And the gifted harpist who comes into his royal chamber to play for him ironically turns out to be David, the one that Yahweh has selected to replace Saul. Well, eventually we see the transfer of power, at least in the eyes of the people, coming in a very well-known story in which the Israelites are fighting against a nation called the Philistines. And the Philistines have a gigantic warrior who is 9 foot 6 inches tall, and his name is Goliath. And Goliath comes out to the Israelites and says to them, "Why should we all fight against one another and have both sides lose so many lives? Instead, I am our best warrior. Send out your best warrior, and we will fight man to man, mano a mano, and whoever wins that battle will say the entire nation wins the battle." Well, everyone in Israel, in their camp, is afraid to do this. Eventually, we do have Jesse sending his youngest son, David, to this military encampment to bring food and supplies to some of David's older brothers who are the soldiers there. And when David sees that everyone, including his brothers, is afraid to fight Goliath, David is embarrassed and says that all you need is the name of Yahweh. All you need is the name of the Lord to go into the battle with you, and you will be victorious. And so eventually the Israelites, including Saul the king, agree to let David be their representative. And David has only the weapon of a slingshot, and he selects 6 stones that he thinks will be good stones to use with his slingshot, and he comes out into the valley between the Philistine and Israelite military camps to challenge Goliath. Goliath thinks this is hilarious, that they've sent out a boy not even wearing any armor to fight him, and Goliath promises David that he will be eaten by the birds before the day is over. And David's witty comeback is to say, no, not me, the birds will be eating you instead. After which David takes out one smooth stone and he hurls it at Goliath. And the Hebrew language is very specific in this story, that the stone buries itself in Goliath's forehead, killing Goliath. And then David takes Goliath's sword, which he can barely lift, cuts off the giant's head and displays it to the Philistines so that they can see that their side has lost, and they immediately begin to flee. Well, there's this enormous parade for the Israelites to come back home. And if you can imagine having the ancient version of cheerleaders on the sideline here, they make up a song of celebration. And of course, Saul, their king, needs to be praised for this victory. And so they sing out, "Yea for King Saul, because he has killed his thousands." And Saul's very pleased to hear all of this praise. And immediately the cheerleaders move into the second verse. And the second verse is, "O great David, for he has killed his tens of thousands." And so therefore the song is exalting David above Saul. And immediately Saul moves from being thankful for David to being very envious of David. We have some occasions on which Saul tries to kill David. Twice while David is playing the harp to calm Saul's nerves, Saul picks up a spear and tosses it at David. David has married one of Saul's daughters, and he attempts to work out a situation in which a spy will come into David's bedroom and kill David during the night. Well, this plan is foiled because Saul has a son named Jonathan, and Jonathan is David's very best friend. And on finding out all of these attempts to assassinate his best friend, Jonathan sees to it that David escapes safely. And so we have David wandering around in the wilderness now, slowly but surely, collecting his own group of followers. And Saul, rather than turning his attention to continuing to defeat the Philistines, becomes obsessed with chasing down David to kill David. And so Saul has his army, and they're going out into the wilderness trying to track David and find him. And on 2 different occasions, we see that David actually has the chance to kill Saul. Once while Saul is in a dark cave, relieving himself. Another time while Saul is in a meadow taking a nap. And on both occasions, David makes it very clear that he could have killed Saul, but he respects the office of King of Israel, King of God's people, and he refuses to do so. Even Saul is seeking to take David's own life. Eventually, the Philistines get so strong that Saul is forced to turn his attention back to them. He and his son Jonathan and several others go into battle against the Philistines. And in that battle, Jonathan, David's best friend, is killed, and Saul is wounded, and it's a mortal wound, and so he falls upon his own sword, and thus Saul is dead. Now, you may think that immediately everyone would see David as the next king, but Saul has many family members that survive this battle, and many people in Israel think that the next king has to come from Saul's line. So we have about a 7-year period within Israel where there's not really a recognition of one person as king. But finally, David, who is serving as the leader in a southernmost region called Hebron, is recognized by all of Israel as their king. Again, that's about 7 years after the death of Saul. And David decides that he is going to move the capital city of Israel to the place that is still recognized as the most prominent city for Judaism today. And that capital city is called Jerusalem, or Jerusalem, which means the victory of peace or striving after peace, Jerusalem. David is considered the most righteous king in Israelite history, even though there are 2 big mistakes that he will make, and I'll briefly describe those in just a moment. He is not considered the greatest king in Israel's history because he is faultless, but because when he does make mistakes, he immediately turns to Yahweh and seeks forgiveness and seeks to have a relationship with Yahweh reestablished. Now, a very important thing that I hope you're keeping up with in your notes here is your list of covenants. And of course, it was not an explicitly stated covenant, but it seems to be an implicit covenant at creation with Adam and Isha, Adam and Eve. And then with Noah, we had our first explicitly stated covenant. And then even more so with Abraham. And then next, Moses through the law. And then your final explicitly stated covenant for Judaism comes with David. If you want a reference here, this story is found in a book called 2 Samuel in the 7th chapter. And in this story, David tells Yahweh that it's not right for all of us to have these beautiful homes in Jerusalem, and there's no permanent structure that's your house where we can worship you. So Yahweh, I want to build you a temple. And Yahweh's response is somewhat surprising. Yahweh says, thanks, but no thanks. I really don't need that temple. But because you have shown this righteous desire to do this for me, I am going to establish an everlasting covenant with you and your descendants. And that is what is unique about this final covenant that will have enormous ramifications for the religion of Christianity, is this idea of an everlasting or eternal covenant with David and his family. Now lastly, before we move on from here, let me describe to you the two great errors, mistakes that David makes. One is referred to as a sin of commission because David actively does something wrong, and one is considered a sin of omission because David, instead of acting, does not do something in response to an evil that has been perpetrated. The first story is the most well-known. The sin of commission is a story when David's army is off fighting and David has stayed back in the capital city of Jerusalem. And while walking around on his rooftop, he sees a beautiful young woman bathing. And even though she's married, and David has several wives also, David decides that he must have her. And so David sends for her to come to the palace. And I want you to think about the culture here. Do you think Bathsheba had much of a choice? It's a patriarchal culture already, and here is the king of all of the people. And if you are a woman in this culture and this man says that he wants you sexually, do you think Bathsheba really had a choice in this matter? Well, there is an affair that takes place between the two, and Bathsheba becomes pregnant, and everyone, of course, knows, or everyone would know if this comes to light, that Bathsheba has cheated on her husband. And so David, in an attempt to try to keep himself from getting caught and having Bathsheba shamed, has her husband Uriah come home from the battlefront, thinking that he will go into the home and have sex with Bathsheba, and the timing will look just about right enough that the baby could be the product of when Uriah returned home. Well, Uriah refuses to even go into his house. He says that if the other men that he's fighting with can't come home and be with their wives, then he will not be with his wife. And so David's plan appears foiled. He invites Uriah over to the palace on the second night and gets Uriah drunk, hoping that the alcohol will be enough of an aphrodisiac that he will go back to his home and finally have sex with his wife Bathsheba. But again, he refuses to do so. And so finally David makes a rash decision to cover his tracks. And he sends Uriah back to battle with a little note for the general named Joab. He tells Joab to put Uriah on the very front lines of battle the next day. And this, of course, puts Uriah in a very dangerous position, and he is killed in battle. And therefore, you could say that David is not only guilty of adultery in this story, but also the murder of Uriah. David is confronted by a prophet named Nathan about this sin. And David does immediately confess his sin. Again, not considered righteous because he is faultless, but righteous because he always repents and seeks Yahweh's forgiveness. And he does receive forgiveness in the story, but is given a couple of consequences. One is that the son of this adulterous relationship will be a very sickly baby and will die soon after he is born. And the second consequence sounds awfully strange, but it will make more sense in just a few minutes. And the second consequence is that David will lose his power, and someone will have sex with all of his women in the sunlight. And really what that means is because it's in the sunlight, everyone sees that David has not been strong enough to hold on to his wives. Someone has been able to take them from him. And so that is the sin of commission. The sin of omission involves some characters here, and this can get a little complicated, so I'll slow down just a bit so you can get the right names in your notes. Again, David has several wives, and with one wife, he has had a son named Amnon, A-M-N-O-N, okay, a son named Amnon. And with another wife, he has had a son named Absalom and a daughter named Tamar. Okay, so on one side we have Amnon, and on the other side we have Absalom and Tamar. And the story tells us that Amnon lusts after his half-sister Tamar and decides that he has to have her. And so he pretends to be sick so that Tamar will be ordered to come into his home to take care of him. And Amnon, upon having his half-sister enter his bedchamber, rapes her. And after he has done raping her, Tamar, as a woman in this culture, has lost her value. Again, I know it is, from our context, a sickly patriarchal aspect, but the woman's value is in her sexuality, and virginity is highly prized, and her virginity has just been taken from her. And so she turns to her half-brother and says, well, now the only course left open to me is for you to do the honorable thing after you've done this disgusting thing and take me as your wife. And we are told that as soon as Amnon has finished raping Tamar, that all of his lust turns into contempt for her, hatred for her. And so he refuses to honor her and kicks her out of his home, making her a woman with really no place in this culture, even though she is the daughter of the king. Well, Absalom, her full-blooded brother, is enraged by this action, and he is waiting for his father David to do something about it. And here is the sin of omission. David does nothing. There are no consequences that Amnon has to pay. And so Absalom takes matters into his own hand, and he has a dinner party at which he slaughters his brother Amnon, his half-brother Amnon. And then Absalom flees because he knows that David will find this unforgivable. It's one thing to have your daughter raped in a patriarchal culture, but to have one of your own sons murdered would seem unforgivable. But eventually David comes to terms that really this wrong is something that falls on him for not acting. And he invites Absalom back into the kingdom to forgive him. The only thing is, Absalom's not really sorry. And so he stirs up a rebellion against his own father, and he gains such strength that he's able to kick King David out of Jerusalem and take hold of the city. At which time that second consequence from the Bathsheba story comes to fruition, as we have Absalom sleeping with all of his father's wives, with the exclusion of his own mother, but having sex with all of his father's wives in the sunlight so that everyone sees that he is taken over. Well, Absalom does not prove to be a very good leader, and David is able to get back many of his supporters and builds up an army and prepares to fight his own son. He gives orders that Absalom is not to be killed in this battle because he is still the son of the king. But we start to see David's power is slipping away from him, because as Absalom is trying to flee the city, we're told in a story that as he's riding on horseback, he has very long hair, and he goes under a tree with a low-hanging branch. At that point, his hair is up in the air, and his hair gets caught up in this branch, and the horse keeps going, and Absalom is left dangling like a Christmas ornament from this tree. And David's general Joab completely ignores David's orders, and they skewer Absalom while he hangs from the tree like a piñata, and David has now lost his sons Amnon and Absalom. David's life is winding down at this point. He is again seen as someone who has lost a lot of his power at the end of his time of sitting on the throne, and one of the last decisions he has to make is about which one of his sons will be the next king. And it turns out to be a son that he has with his wife Bathsheba, because he did marry her after Uriah was killed. And of course that first child died soon after he was born, but another child is born, and his name is Solomon. And Solomon will be the third and final king of a united Israel. So In this story of Israel, you only have 3 kings over a united kingdom: Saul, David, and then Saul. I'm sorry, Saul, David, and then Solomon. The big mistake that most people make about Solomon, for those who have heard a bit of his story before, is to think that he is a righteous king. And the reason for this is because there's an early story told about him in which Yahweh says that he will give to Solomon any gift that he wants. And Yahweh is impressed that rather than seeking after women or wealth, Solomon asks for wisdom. But this will be really the only time we see Solomon painted in a good light. The one little story told about him to demonstrate his wisdom, I'm going to suggest to you, is a story that is told in a facetious or sarcastic way. I'll tell you the story, and then I'll tell you my interpretation, which is going to be different than what many of you have heard before, if you've heard the story at all. There were 2 Israelite women sharing an apartment, and they both had children around the same time. And during the night, one of the women sadly rolled over on her own child and suffocated the baby. And she is so upset by this that the next morning she attempts to grab the baby of the other woman with whom she shares the apartment to pretend as if that is her child now. And of course, the mother of the baby fights back against this, and the 2 women are brought before Solomon, and Solomon in his wisdom is supposed to detect which woman is the real mother. And he says, well, I really don't know which one of you is the real mother, so just bring the baby here to me, and I'm going to chop the baby in 2 with my sword, and I'll give you each half a baby. Well, one woman says, that sounds good to me. Go ahead and cut the child in 2, and I'll take my half home. And the other woman says, oh, no, absolutely not. Let the child live. Please let the child live, and the child can go with her. The most important thing is let the baby live. And Solomon says, oh, in my wisdom, I'm able to tell that you who said it was okay to chop the baby in 2, you're not the real mother, but you whose primary concern is that the baby lives, you're the real mother. Well, the reason I suggest the story is sarcastic is twofold. First, the reason that's not all that important is anyone, I think, could tell who the real mother is quite easily from a story like that. But really the main reason is that everything Solomon does after this point is the opposite of wise. It's extremely foolish. Remember that Yahweh really didn't want a temple when David said that he would build one. Yahweh said we can wait for another generation. Well, Solomon decides that he's the one who will build the temple. Pardon me. The big mistake that he makes is that he enslaves his very own people to build this temple, and it takes 7 years. So for 7 years to build this temple, Solomon has forced his own people into slavery, and so they start to resent him and turn against him. And even though he had asked for wisdom instead of women and wealth is exactly what Solomon does store up. He ends up with 300 wives and 700 concubines, similar to what we may refer to as a mistress today. And these women are brought in from all different regions around the area, and in these regions they worship other gods. And so when they come into Jerusalem, they tell Solomon, you know, it's fine for you to worship your God Yahweh at the temple, but that's not my God. Can I please build a shrine, a sanctuary where I can worship my God? And here he is, king of Israel. You know, you have the one God Yahweh, and now we have Solomon allowing his wives and mistresses to erect all of these different sanctuaries to worship other gods. So Solomon, king of Israel, has just invited idolatry, one of the primary sins within Judaism, into the kingdom of Israel. And so by the time Solomon is about to die, we have a kingdom that has turned against Yahweh and a kingdom that is very divided. We see that there is a son of Solomon named Rehoboam who appears that he's going to be the next king, but he is such a rebellious and arrogant and cocky young man that most of the people end up following a fellow who had been head of the slave labor that had built the temple, a fellow named Jeroboam. So the names sound similar. Rehoboam and Jeroboam become the kings of a divided kingdom. And something that you need to get down in your notes here is that 10 of the tribes break off to the north, and they are referred to as the northern kingdom or Israel. Okay, 10 of the tribes break off to the north, and they are referred to as the northern kingdom or Israel. and this is where Jeroboam will be king. The two remaining tribes, of course, break off to the south, and they do have the city of Jerusalem, and this area is called the southern kingdom or Judah. Okay, the southern kingdom or Judah, and this is where Solomon's son Rehoboam will be king. Now, neither Rehoboam or Jeroboam are righteous kings in this split kingdom, and as the story continues to unfold, we see that there is nothing but wicked kings in the north after Jeroboam, and we see in the south that occasionally there will come a righteous king who tries to bring about a reform, but there are also many wicked kings in the southern kingdom of Judah also. Because these kings of Israel and Judah fail to be righteous kings, we do see the rise of what we refer to as the prophetic tradition within Israel. And this means that because the kings are not representing Yahweh correctly, that there must be a countercultural, or really a radical figure that will try to bring the way of Yahweh or the word of Yahweh to the people. And this is exactly what the term prophet means, someone who brings forth the word of Yahweh. And pictured here is a radical looking fellow. This is Elijah, and Elijah is confronting the most wicked king and queen of the northern kingdom of Israel. This is King Ahab and his wife Jezebel. And in the northern kingdom, they have introduced worship of that old Canaanite god Bel and his wife Asherah, and they have toppled over the places of worshiping Yahweh in the northern kingdom, because remember, they don't have Jerusalem, they don't have the temple in the northern kingdom, so they've toppled over these altars and places of worshiping Yahweh, and in their place they have placed altars and shrines for worshiping Bel and Asherah. Because of this, Yahweh punishes them by sending a drought upon the land, and when Yahweh is ready to have the end of the drought, he wants to teach the people of the northern kingdom a lesson that he, Yahweh, is the only true God. And so Elijah challenges all of the hundreds and hundreds of prophets of Bel and Asherah to a contest on top of a mountain called Carmel or Carmel. And on top of this mountain, you can see an altar that is dedicated to Yahweh that has fallen into disrepair. It has weeds growing all over it and vines. And then you also have an altar for worshiping Baal, and it has been kept up well because it's being actively used. Well, the contest that is proposed is that the prophets of Baal are to place a bull upon their altar, and they need to sacrifice the bull. The only challenge is they can't use any fire. They have to call on Baal to send down fire from heaven. And so they prepare their bull and place the bull upon the altar. They call out to Baal for fire from heaven. Nothing happens. They start dancing around the altar and taking out daggers and cutting their wrists and forearms to show their dedication to Baal, but still nothing happens. And Elijah's in the background here being a real smartass. He says, well, what's going on with your God? He must be busy doing something else. And even at one point he even says, I know, Baal must be using the bathroom. He must be relieving himself, and that's why he's not taking your sacrifice. Well, eventually they have to give up, and Elijah places his bull upon the altar for Yahweh that he has repaired, and he digs a moat, a ditch around the altar, and he fills up many, many huge jars of water, and he douses the bull with this water so that the water runs off of the bull and fills up this entire ditch that he's dug. And so the idea being here that the bull is so wet that even if Elijah had fire, there's no way that he could set this bull on fire. And he calls out to Yahweh for fire from heaven, and fire comes down from heaven immediately and consumes the bull. And all the people surrounding this show see this take place, and they turn back to Yahweh, and they charge after the prophets of Baal and Asherah and slaughter them all. Of course, this makes Jezebel very angry, and she will spend the rest of her life, as well as Ahab, trying to chase down Elijah to kill him. But a spectacular story of Elijah's life is that he never does die. There's another prophet that is ready to take his place named Elisha, spelled the same way as Elijah, but with an SH instead of a J. And Elisha and Elijah walk to the other side of the Jordan River, and we have a fire-like chariot sweep down from the heavens and pick up Elijah and take him up into the heavens. And this is one belief that's within the ancient Hebrew faith, and even for some modern Jews today, is the belief that because Elijah never died, that one sign of the end of times is the return of Elijah. And you will see that this idea flourishes prominently in the Christian religion. Well, after we have all these stories about prophets like Elijah and Elisha, we see a transition taking place within the prophetic tradition. Rather than stories about prophets, we end up seeing within the Hebrew Bible that there are the sermons and teachings of later prophets that have been recorded. And we see that the primary message of these sermons deal with two issues, two primary sins of how Israel and Judah are not following Yahweh. One of these is quite ethical. It is concerned with the oppression of the poor. We see the prophets talk about this more than any other issue, that the Israelites and also the people of Judah down in the south are not taking care of the widow and the orphan who are left without resources in this culture, and they also are not taking care of the foreigner. Now, this is a really new idea. We saw in the earlier stories, especially of the taking of the promised land, that you are to destroy the foreigner because he or she represents a threat of worshiping other gods. And now we see instead that it is Israel's job to accept and take care of the foreigner. So the message changes here a bit. But also the second major concern of these writing prophets is the issue of idolatry. So yes, you take care of the foreigner, but you would not fall into their practices of worshiping other gods like Baal. The three primary examples that you have for the writing prophets, sometimes called the major prophets, are Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. And we have these prophets not only giving sermons and teachings, but sometimes they perform things that are symbolic actions to demonstrate the message of Yahweh. I'll give you one example here. Ezekiel is the most well-known prophet for symbolic actions. And on one occasion, he shaves off his beard, and he divides all of the shavings into three different piles. And one pile he chops up with his knife, another pile he sets on fire, and the third one he throws up into the air so that the wind blows it away. And Ezekiel's message is, because you've been so disobedient to Yahweh, you're either going to die by the sword or die by fire or be thrown away into exile, which means to have your homes taken away from you. Jeremiah, he's primarily known for complaining to Yahweh, of saying, I didn't have any choice in this thing. You placed your message within me, and when I try to keep my mouth closed, it's like a fire burning in my bones. I have to speak the message even though I don't want to, and the reason I don't want to is because it makes everybody hate me. And so we actually have a word in our English language called a Jeremiad, which is a speech of complaint. And that word comes from the prophet Jeremiah, that he had these speeches of complaint against Yahweh. And Isaiah, more than any other prophet, seems to have the biggest influence on a person that will emerge many years later within the context of Israel, and that will be Yeshua of Nazareth, or Jesus. It's quite obvious that Jesus read the words of Isaiah and identified himself with much of what Isaiah taught. Probably most importantly, the fact that Isaiah has 4 songs called the Songs of the Suffering Servant, in which he shows the idea of salvation for people coming not through having power and defeating others, but that through suffering and through defeat, one finally comes to salvation. That in a sense you almost have to lose everything before you can appreciate what it is to have God's presence in your life. And that seems to be a major point that Isaiah has in his sermons. For testing purposes, the information on this slide is extremely important, so even though it won't be a really lengthy slide, please get down this information. I hope you can hear in what I'm saying, hint, hint, hint. You're going to have at least a couple of test questions coming from this. Returning to the idea of Israel being the northern kingdom with 10 tribes and Judah being the southern kingdom with 2 tribes, we do see that with wicked king after wicked king in the northern kingdom of Israel, there is a nation to the north that eventually becomes so strong they are able to march into the northern kingdom and defeat the Israelites and to force especially the wealthiest citizens into exile, which again, exile means to take people away from their homes and bring them into the conquering nation and make them work as servants or slaves in the homes of others, and in this case in Assyria. And it appears that these Assyrians are going to be able to march down and also defeat the southern kingdom of Judah. But because we do have righteous kings on occasion in Judah, we do come to an episode where a somewhat righteous king named Hezekiah is able to head off the Assyrian threat. Really, it's through the work of Yahweh. Yahweh judges Hezekiah as being obedient enough that Yahweh sends an angel of death through the Assyrian camp and slaughters many of the thousands upon thousands of these Assyrian soldiers, so they finally retreat back home. Now, dates are not always an extremely important aspect on my exams, but in this case, these are two dates that you are most certainly responsible for. The first one I'll cover right now, and again, your textbook may be different by a year or two here because it depends on which particular calendars are being looked at, but for purposes of exam, please pay attention to the numbers that I give you here. In 722 BC or BCE, we do have the northern kingdom of Israel being defeated by these Assyrians. These 10 tribes of Israel are taken into exile, and in the centuries that follow, they become so assimilated with the Assyrian and later on the Babylonian culture. The Babylonians will eventually defeat the Assyrians. These 10 tribes become so assimilated that they are considered historically the 10 lost tribes of Israel, that these 10 tribes become so intermarried with other people groups that these 10 tribes have historically been lost forever. Now, there are some other religions that will offer a counter story to this. You all have probably heard of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or the Mormon tradition. There's teachings there that will say that the Native Americans or the Western Indians represent part of, if not all of the descendants of these 10 lost tribes of Israel. So there is a counter story that would have an explanation for these tribes, that they somehow migrated and made it to the Western Hemisphere, certainly long before the European colonists came over. Now again, the Babylonian culture has a king with a great name, Nebuchadnezzar. Okay, don't worry about spelling that. It would take all day long. Nebuchadnezzar is the king of the Babylonian Empire, and he will eventually be the one strong enough to march into the southern kingdom of Judah. And here's your second date. In 587 BCE, we do have the defeat of Jerusalem, the southern kingdom of Judah, and the people of Judah are taken into exile. But this will only be a 70-year exile, and we'll return to this at the beginning of the next lecture. But because it is only a 70-year exile, these two tribes of Judah and Benjamin in the south, these are not lost historically, but are considered in many ways to be the ancestors of modern Jews today, with the exception, of course, for those that convert to Judaism. In 587, when Jerusalem is defeated, the Temple of Solomon is destroyed. So the temple, the place where the people meet with God and worship and make sacrifices, that is completely destroyed. And because the temple is the only place where you can properly make these sacrifices for this time that the people are in exile away from Jerusalem with no temple, that will not be a part of their life as Hebrew or Israelite people. All right, and we will leave it there, and I think you have just one more lecture on Judaism that should be posted early next week. I do hope you all have been enjoying your spring break. I'm glad we still have a few days left.